When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite, looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen, this is the blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
This is Richie McGinnis. Listen to Crazy Train Radio.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
This next guest has certainly a unique background, both from an educational standpoint, from studying things like Middle Eastern history and minoring in Arabic and philosophy, but also has worked in different forms of the media. So this will certainly be an interesting conversation and talking about his book.
Ladies and gentlemen, to dive into this interesting story, because it's a lot of real life stuff when we're talking the book, Riot Diet, one man's radical ride through American and chaos. Mr. Richie McGinnis. Richie, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Right on. So, obviously, things are chaotic. It had been for, I'd say, at least 8 years at this point with some of the shit that's been going on. Not just politically, but, just everything. So, you got an interesting background as well, which we'll get into. But why do you think it was the right time to write this book?
Well, I think my story of coming to DC in 2008 and basically going from knocking on doors for Obama in 2008 as an idealistic 18-year-old, helping to turn Virginia blue. So I guess you have me to partially to thank for that. But, from there to fast forward 2017 when Trump got elected, and I'm running the video at the Daily Caller, which was founded by Tucker Carlson, and there were actually a lot of Bernie supporters who followed Daily Caller during the 2016 campaign, but by the time I started, mostly had started dropping off. And, it was effectively a largely pro-Trump audience during the Trump years, ending with COVID and all of the riots that, we witnessed across the country, across the political spectrum as well, the BLM, and then all the MAGA stuff in DC.
Yeah. So, like I said, there's a lot to cover there. And, it's funny because, like you said, with the riots and everything like that, you talk about some of the most chaotic and polarizing protests in American history, from things like the George Floyd protests and riots through January 6th with this book.
Well,
So,
this book covers up to Kenosha, and part two will cover all the MAGA side of stuff, the Proud Boys rally in Portland in September, all the way through to the Stop the Steal rallies, the election, the Stop the Steal rallies in January 6th. So,
yeah.
part one
So,
is
yeah.
um,
Like,
so this covers the
so, you know, why would you say, if anything, or I shouldn't say it like that, but what would you think decided to get people wire all fired up? Is it all political, or is it racial? What do you think it was? That was there a certain spark to get things going?
Well, I think that's part of why I took the time to write the book. Is it's a more, each side had their own narrative, and the answer to that question is the answer to the question of, what the reality on the ground was. It's a combination of both narratives. And so I think it's a mix of everything that you just mentioned. But specifically, what I cite in the book is the difference between this period of civil unrest and previous ones is that we have social media, and we basically all have, sitting in our pockets, access to these platforms that will show us everything in real time, the raw video of what's going on with this political tribe or that on the ground. And I think that's really kind of added fuel to the flames, as well as, the way that the media, I think, has approached the Trump era. All of that kind of went into this soup that, the pandemic then boiled up. And when everyone was locked down at home and, the BLM stuff started, that side of the political spectrum was activated to go hit the streets. And then, when 2020 election went the way that it did, the other side of the spectrum did effectively, it's the same story told in two different directions, descending into chaos. And it doesn't take much for somebody, in your group, your political group, your tribe, you see them get pepper sprayed, the tear gas comes out, and the whole, you use a different part of your brain at that point. And I think that's what people sitting at home on their screens don't understand. And that's what this book tries to communicate, is what it was like to be actually on the ground. Who were the people there? What did they say their reasons were for being there? And, what actually was the bigger picture beyond just this guy's either a good guy or a bad guy, domestic terrorist, or, a vigilante or a hero or a white supremacist, all these different labels that were put on the folks that I met on the ground.
And, it's interesting because, and obviously people will have their different opinions of this, but when it comes to media, and obviously I studied that in college as well, besides history, which we both have in common, is that in the States, it's probably some of the most sorted through. And when I say that, it's because depending on the media outlet, it might be skimmed through. What do we show? What do we don't show? And what's the narrative we're going with? Where other countries will, or at least were when I was in school, they would show a lot more, a lot more graphic, a lot more, in telling this story. but also with you being essentially boots on the ground with the outlets you were working with, you would live stream from your phone and have raw
Correct.
footage.
Yeah.
So, how do you think, the world of social media and different things like that to be able to live stream has affected how things are being told?
Yeah, well, I don't want to give too much away about the ending of this story, the BLM story, which was for me Kenosha. But that was the perfect example of how citizen journalists and independent media on the ground with their cell phones really captured the essential moments when, I mean, the New York Times reporter actually went home that day in Kenosha because they knew it was going to be, very dangerous after the previous two nights of rioting. And I don't blame them for going home. But with that being said, the shooting that took place, it was all independents who captured the actual chaos on the ground. There was one Washington Post reporter right up the street, but other than that, there was a handful of 8 different streamers and independents from the local area all the way, to big Twitter personalities and whatnot that were actually on the ground though. So yeah, the cell phone I think has totally changed the way that journalism, the way that stuff from on the ground reaches the public. With that being said, there are a number of different filters. So, it used to be cable news and print media. You had to kind of go through those gates. But what I describe in the book is also these social media algorithms, which, effectively favor a particular kind of content. And being on the ground, I reveal, what got bought by what media outlets and why. And that reveals kind of how, these different segments, these different little sound bites from what the bigger picture that I witnessed on the ground get kind of scooped up by the greater media. And that was, I'm very frank with the fact that was part of our business model, was to sell our footage from on the ground. But, it was frequently just chopped up into these little sound bites to prove this side or that. And so while citizen journalism and people with cell phones and independent media have really, I think, changed the game for journalism, and I think this election is representative of that. The podcasters as well, throw them in there. What all of that still has to go through these YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and I make the case that those algorithms do favor polarizing content because you're going to stay scrolling on your phone. You're much more likely to do that if you get what's called a hate click, which is when people are angry and online, they're much more likely to stay in their feeds. You kind of have to appeal to the most basic and primal aspects of humanity, whether it's anger or lust or jealousy. That's what keeps people on these platforms.
So, with the different protests and stuff that you witnessed, now obviously in my head, obviously you would hear or see about the most extreme, let's say, like a January 6th or certain BLM riots. And, you hear certain things at the top, but would you say there was also on the chain of things peaceful protests as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I cover those in the book, these moments that were entirely peaceful. And, there was that classic line, it's a party-like atmosphere. Another one was, fiery, but mostly peaceful. The complete truth is that there were both, every night in Portland is another great example of, you'd have the demonstrators come out, right around sunset. You'd have the speeches go. There'd be 5,000 people. And then 500 of those people stick around to smash into the fence and agitate the police. So one side of the media is calling them, mostly peaceful or entirely peaceful. And then the other side's calling them domestic BLM terrorists and showing the footage from later in the night. And I just show that complete picture of like, look, there were 5,000 people and then there were 500 people and they were doing this. They were peaceful then, they were singing songs, and then, it's absolute chaos 3 hours later in front of the fence, in front of the courthouse. Fires being lit and tear gas everywhere and fireworks and lasers and everything you can imagine, leaf blowers. So, and that chapter is actually called The Battle of the Leaf Blowers, just to show how absurd things got during that time. But I think, people were activated by what we were talking about earlier, which is kind of everybody sitting home locked down, looking at the screens of their phones and getting angrier about, either Orange Man good or Orange Man bad. And I think that's ultimately what drove people to the streets, was this political divisiveness that's really, I think, ramped up. It wasn't just the Trump era. I think that the end of the Obama years with the Tea Party, things started to go in that direction. But I go through a lot of that in that history as well in the book. And I know you mentioned you're interested in history. So there's a lot of looking in the rearview mirror to kind of figure out, okay, well, we've been here before, but how is this time different? And I think the digital aspect is a huge part of that.
Yeah, because I don't know how to compare it. I guess I can essentially with the history background in terms of I would compare recent times with, say, some parts of the later 60s, but also Vietnam era.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the only problem is I can't fully compare it because it's not like back then we had cell phones and videos and social media to see things going on.
That's I actually make that comparison between, well, specifically the Stonewall riots in 1969. They were, I was June 30th, I believe, June 29th, June 30th. But, during that time period, it was all the tabloids that put, because what people learned about what was going on the streets was through newspapers and print media. And at that time, early cable news, 4 different channels. And so the tabloids put the Stonewall riots on the front page. Meanwhile, the New York Times, they put it on page 33. So, and this, they give them one little sliver and dismiss it as a roaming band of homosexuals and homosexual youths. And, so it was very dismissive the way the Times covered that then. And the question that I ask in 2020 and today, I think it still rings true, is like, if back then, I think it was very much a divide between young and old. And this time around, I just cite, the schism is really almost like 50-50. And so the question is like, where's counterculture coming from? If, especially with the most recent election, Trump isn't just this fringe kind of populist character who popped into the limelight for a moment, and I think that, I wrote this book knowing that Trump was going to return. All the publishers told me that Trump wasn't running again when I was starting the book in 2022, that he'd never make it through the primaries. DeSantis was going to be the guy. And I think in media, people have a tendency to think what they want to happen is what's going to happen. And I had recognized just through, I actually worked for Mark Levin. I actually went from Al-Jazeer Arabic to NBC, MSNBC to working as a video editor for conservative radio guy, Mark Levin. He had an online show.
Levin TV.
And then I went to Daily Caller. So I saw kind of both sides of America in so far as like what the major personalities in those landscapes are putting forth and what the audience is responding to. And I think, the moment that Bernie Sanders got sandbagged, or you can call it whatever you want, in 2016 by the Clinton campaign, that really, I knew that Trump was going to win, because it was like there was all this pent up frustration that the hope and change from the Obama years didn't really, have a positive impact on people after the financial collapse of 2008. I was a senior in high school when that all happened, entering college. And so from my perspective, like, I decided to start my own publishing company because people were telling me that I had to, number one, pick a side if I wanted to sell books. And number two, Trump wasn't running again at the time I started. So I just went and did it on my own with the pigeon right here, if you can see him down below, Pigeon Press. And, I got the author of Jarhead, Anthony Swafford, on board as my editorial advisor just through serendipity. My cousin got drunk with him at a book party 20 years ago and put me in touch. And Swafford believed in my, mission to basically tell the bigger reality rather than just one that satisfies this side or that. And I cite various distortions that were made sound bites that were taken out of context by both sides of the political spectrum, Fox News and CNN and legacy media, print media. So I think if you look back to that time and compare that to today, you're right that the mediums are different. But even still, everyone's like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and even Amazon, where I'm selling this book, those are all algorithm driven, multi-billion-dollar funded massive corporations. So we're still being filtered through, I think, this lens of like a media landscape that rewards, I guess you could call it rhetoric and a certain type of discourse that yields shock and retweets and engagement. And I think a lot of people, it's very easy to like get on Twitter and just satisfy this group, and feed them what they want to see. And so I think, the landscape still rewards kind of like this bifurcated view of the world.
Well, working with the different outlets that you mentioned, Al-Jazeer, MSNBC, Mark Levin's channel and such, how would you say it's changed your perspective on?
That's a good question. Well, I like I said, I came to DC, a really idealistic Obama voter / volunteer in Virginia. I was at Georgetown, right across the bridge in DC, and he had this message of hope and change. And I was studying Arabic and Middle Eastern history at the time, and he had this Washington Post op-ed that he wrote in 2008 during his campaign. This was in, I think, July of 2008, and I cite this in the book as well. He promised to pull all of the troops out of the Middle East. And so I was studying Arabic over the course of his first term and watching, I watched him appoint Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State. I watched what happened in Libya, and, which was effectively Muammar Gaddafi, who was, yes, albeit a dictator. There are a lot of dictators in the world, but a dictator who specifically wanted to go off the petrodollar and create, a gold standard backed, oil backed currency in Africa. And so ultimately, like, all the multinational banks and all that, this kind of blob whose special interests really ultimately control DC, all these massive corporations, they said, no, I don't think so. And, Libya exported like 80-something% of its oil to Europe at that time. And it's, like that was the lifeblood of the European economy. So I saw all of those kind of like foreign policy blunders, after Obama made these promises, and really it became disillusioned with what I would call the uniparty, which is the overlap between the Democratic and Republican parties. I think, especially in the last 30 years, of favoring laissez-faire economic policies and also simultaneously, starting foreign wars and funding the military-industrial complex on both sides of the political spectrum, whether it's Clinton or Bush 1 or Bush 2, or Obama. Ultimately, he didn't pull the troops out. Let's leave it at that. So, I started working for Mark Levin at the end of Obama's second term, and having been in NBC's newsroom, I saw how, the coastal elite of which I was a part, having grown up in New York and going to school in DC, like I saw how they looked down on these, I think the classic line was the MAGA rubes, or deplorables, or, what was Kamala Harris's version this time around? I'm trying to recall. I can't remember, but it basically this idea that anybody who votes for Trump is stupid and they have to be morally inferior, and that kind of condescending approach to anybody who comes from outside. And I'm not justifying, Trump's like words. I'm not justifying his approach, his behavior by any means. I'm just laying out, I think, through my own eyes, how I saw that the media, military, industrial complex in Washington, D.C. were all on this gravy train, and average Americans got their jobs shipped overseas and, felt like they couldn't make ends meet. And ultimately that, the way that I think my perspective has changed to today is that, the economy and the way in which the American economy benefits American citizens, and not this idea of a global harmonious community. I think ultimately, Clinton endorsed that, Bush 1 endorsed that, Obama endorsed that, Bush 2 endorsed that, and Trump's ascendancy was really a repudiation on that approach. America first, make America great again. So I'm not answering the question of whether America is great, or giving a definitive answer of like, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. I didn't vote for Trump in any of the elections. I also didn't vote for any of the alternatives in the two-party system. And I'm more focused on like, what the Trump era means, and just telling people, what I witnessed through my own journey across DC and across the spectrum. So it's the economy, stupid, I guess, would be my take. And you can say what you want about Trump's antics, but that's ultimately, I think, what won the day.
I'll put this out there. I don't care. I'm not a fan of Trump for several reasons. But since you brought that up, just how everything is laid out, I'd be curious to know. And obviously, we're still in present moment. And so it's maybe hard to look at with full 2020 vision and, clarity and all. But how would you think this era will be written about and talked about, say, 10, 15, 20, 25 years from now, being a history guy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's the question that I asked myself continually as I was writing, which is like, I wanted the book not to satisfy, this side or that so I could sell books today, but I wanted it to stand up in 20 years to put somebody in my shoes, what it was like in that moment in time. I mean, everybody remembers COVID like it was a dream, and so I wanted to chronicle what I witnessed with thousands of videos from on the ground. And there's a lot of photos in the book as well. But I think ultimately, this period of unrest, I think what I would call a paradigm shift. It's happened previously in American history. There was a populist movement. William Jennings Bryan lost in 1896, but he was appealing to, I think, a lot of the same working class ideas that Trump campaigned on in 2016 and 2020, 24, which is like, the average American is getting stepped on by the big guy. And that was on the tail end of the Gilded Age, when, the gap between the rich and the poor was at its widest point, aside from during the pandemic, when, you saw like the Jeff Bezos became the richest man in the world. And so there's this moment that I documented in the book where we're in the Chaz in Seattle, which was basically, for those who don't know, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. It was a police precinct. It was vacated and effectively handed over to protesters, BLM protesters, in the spirit of de-escalation, according to the mayor and the police commissioner. And the first thing they did, was put checkpoints, barriers, not border walls, but barriers, and armed guards at the checkpoints. And, that power vacuum descended into chaos. 2 people ended up dying, actually Black kids, 19 and 16 years old. But there's this moment where we marched from Chaz to the other police precinct that was still functioning. It was the West Precinct in the middle of the commercial district of Seattle. And we're literally in the shadow of the Amazon Tower, 3-tower complex right behind us. And there's a 2-story police precinct in front of us. And they're giving the finger to these, cops that are making $100,000 a year or whatever. And Jeff Bezos right behind us is becoming the richest man in the world, doubling his revenue effectively during the pandemic. And so, while all these small businesses were shut down, all the richest people in the American economy, the global economy, were, and all the people who could afford to work from home at their white collar jobs, they were doing fine. But what I'm, showing in that instance is that our focus, via these media channels that were all telling us, this is what you have to do, this is the cause that matters, and if you take to the streets, then you're going to impact positive change. Well, they were focused on the most common chant, I guess, other than Black Lives Matter, was all cops are bastards. And so that appears dozens of times in the book, and I heard it hundreds of times while I was on the ground. and just the idea that every single cop in the entire United States is a bastard, and that
Not true.
we're focused on that instead of the Amazon complex right behind everybody. And so, like I was saying earlier, the economy and what economic opportunities for the next generation, this idea that our generation is better off than our parents were. I think the majority of people my age don't feel that way. And it was my age and younger who were out in the streets. And I think that's a pervading idea amongst the population. And one of the reasons why, a bull in the china shop, I'm going to change things in Washington candidate like Trump, has been been able to endure over this entire, I guess now, 8-year process, even more than that, almost a decade.
Yeah, exactly. For me, somebody told me a long time ago from the wrestling business. Surprisingly, this came from, but I think it works across the board in any aspect of life. And that's in terms of asking questions. And the way they phrased it to me was whatever you're talking about, whenever you're talking about it, you would start out with, well, what if are the two most key words.
Mm-hmm.
And then you dive into what you're questioning, whether it's politics, whether it's the Black Lives Matter, whatever you're talking, whether it's TV, politics, movies, whatever the subject is.
Yeah.
You should always ask, what if? You may not agree with the answers on whatever the topic is, but you should always open up, because it at least starts the conversation with open mind, if that makes sense. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, I guess we did ask that question, what if, when all the protests started and all the big media companies were sitting outside these protest zones with their big cameras and their microphones saying, well, it's this and it's that. And, we said, what if we went in there and just recorded the raw video and related to oh, sorry, I didn't put my ringer off. What if we just went in there and did this? And, the question was based around basically showing people what was going on without like commentary or spin, just live streaming when it was safe enough, or just relaying raw video clips and saying he was wearing this and he was doing that. Oh, sorry, let me silence this thing. But that what if, the answer, the part that we didn't like was, if you're gonna take that approach, then you're not going to get that kind of attention that you would if you did provide the commentary, right? So if you're going into these protest zones and you're saying these people are righteous, look at how awesome this one aspect is, or you're saying, look at how bad these guys are, and I'm showing you the reality of how bad it is. If you're just showing that one of those two lenses, then you're going to get a lot more attention within those two different spheres. And basically what my boss told me, Jeff Ingersoll, he was a Marine, he was in Iraq, was in Afghanistan, and he very, very simply said, like, you guys can, editorialize what's going on for more retweets, but you'll get fired. And that was our mission from the beginning. So that was difficult to do, because the answer to that what if was like, well, you're going to be the enemy of the protesters at certain times. You're going to be the enemy of the police at certain times when, they're acting scurrilous. They're doing bad things on both sides of that. You're going to be the enemy of the right. Sometimes when we record the Proud Boys beating down some hapless guy in Chaz in Seattle, beating the crap out of this guy, and a couple of the Proud Boys were on parole, we still had to put that footage out there. And the same goes for, the most extreme elements of the left who were trying to start fires, trying to start fights with police, agitating police, and the police who were unnecessarily exercising force. So we were the friends of nobody. So I guess like the full answer to that question is like, yes, you're exactly right when you say you have to ask what if, but then, carrying it through can be, and the answer to that question can be a lot more difficult. And that was really my journey with the book too, which is like shopping it around to different publishers and having them tell me you need to do this or that. And, my approach was, what if I wrote a book about what I witnessed and what I recorded with my phone and just described, what I saw and kind of let the audience decide. I mean, I certainly include opinion in there just because I have to explain why I aimed my camera here or why I aimed it there, why I asked this or that, and, what my worldview was going in. And so with all that being said, like the answer to that what if question was, you have a lane and you need to stay in it. And I think that's what's really lost in the modern era of journalism is like, is your lane to tell everybody your opinion on every single topic, including like, geopolitical flare-ups in the Middle East or in Ukraine or, domestic issues or, like everybody's an expert in everything now and everybody thinks that the whole world wants to hear their opinion. It's like, what's your lane in this media landscape? And so our lane in that period of time was just to relay the raw video. And that's what I set forth to do in the book as well. So it's certainly, if I had known how much work the book was going to be published, doing it on my own, getting my own editors, getting my own company going, I might not have done it in the first place. So I did ask that what if, but a lot of times working through the answer is like, really, I think where, the rubber meets the road. Are you really going to stay on that path?
Well, the thing I wanted to ask on the personal side, and I found it interesting, is you did go to Georgetown University. You majored in Middle Eastern history with minor in Arabic and philosophy. So what led you down that road to try to study those topics?
That's a good, and I do talk about my time in the Middle East, actually, right before the Arab Spring. I was in Tahrir Square, I was in Israel, I was in Lebanon. I saw kind of both sides of that conflict, that ancient conflict in the Middle East. And I think, studying, well, Arabic was my minor, but it was actually more credits than my major. So it was 5 days a week for an hour a day for 3 years, intensive language program. And so, just like with the book, if I had known how hard it was going to be going in, I probably wouldn't have done it. But after learning Arabic, I speak Spanish and have traveled extensively through Central America and South America. Learning a different language, going to a different culture, especially the Middle East, which is like very foreign to, like Latin America is not so much different from the United States, but having to think from their perspective, seeing the world through their perspective, hearing the call to prayer 5 times a day, I think, it led to a certain curiosity to learn different cultures, to learn why different places, different cultures think the way that they do, how they view the world. And so when it came to covering the protests, whether it was, in front of the Portland courthouse, the BLM stuff, the protests/riots, or the protests/riots of the Stop the Steals and January 6th, my goal was like, okay, what's the language here? So like when I was going out to the lefty protests, I'd bring White Claws and doobies. And when I was going out to interview the Proud Boys, I would bring Budweisers and cigarettes as like my peace offering. And so that really and the same thing in the Middle East is like everybody offers you a cigarette. And I actually never smoked a cigarette in my life until I was 21 years old. And I was in a cab on my way to the University of Jordan, which I describe in the second book. But all that to say that I think, and philosophy as well, like if you're studying history, if you're studying a language, especially the same region that you're studying historically, you really are able to, I guess, take yourself outside of your own worldview. And I think that's an important thing, an important exercise in this day and age, just because like everybody's so dug into their trenches that when their worldview is confronted or challenged, they dig in their heels. So that's why I think, I don't have a particular demographic or side of the political spectrum. I don't even have an answer for who would enjoy the book more. I think, if you're from the political right, you would enjoy getting an inside look at like what it was like running a Facebook and YouTube business for a pro-Trump news outlet during the Trump years. And then I think if you're from the left, it will help you understand, how we got here today. And my journey largely, I think, tells that story as well, is like, how did I go from growing up in the New York area, going to Georgetown, like you said, in DC, which is far from a Trump stronghold, and then, working where I did. I certainly wouldn't say that, like, I think workplace in the present era has become typecast. And so, everybody assumed that I was, especially when the Kenosha shootings took place, everybody was saying, well, he works here, so he's this. And, I was running a video operation. I needed like kind of creative types who are not your typical cutout, buttoned up, bow tie wearing conservatives. So running this kind of like creative enclave within the Daily Caller is also, I think, gives like a good look for anybody across the political spectrum to see kind of like both sides and how they interact during those polarizing times. And like while we were out on the riot trail, I described, all of our political views. Shelby, Jorge, and I, who I mostly traveled with during the protests, we were across the spectrum, and we would be disagreeing in the car ride over about, this issue or Trump's latest this or tweet or that or whatever. But ultimately, like, just like my family who had my back the whole time through this, our political disagreements had nothing to do with our mission to, be a team who had this what if question of what if we just recorded it and showed the world. And then also my family is just like, the mission of being a family and backing your, my mom was there, and my brothers, had my back when the poop hit the fan. I don't know if I can swear on here.
You can say it. That's fine.
And I think, that's why my particular story, I think, is especially applicable, is like you have to go into the belly of the beast before you can really understand it. And so within the context of the chaotic events that were taking place and getting caught up in that media machine, and my firsthand perspective of that is like, and how I had to fight to correct the record, specifically what I emailed, specifically, how my words were taken out of context and why. It just shows like how our media landscape functions today during the most polarizing moments, the most tragic moments, whether it's Kenosha, the shooting in Kenosha, or January 6th.
Absolutely. Well, the book is Riot Diet, One Man's Radical Ride Through America in Chaos. So, Mr. McGinnis, thank you so much for the time.
We'll get it up close there. That one's not for resale, but it is for sale now. And
yes,
you can go on Amazon and find it there. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Hey there, Friday fans. We know how much you enjoy the movies. Enjoy grabbing your Friday merchandise and interacting with the Friday family, whether it be at conventions or during our particular watch-alongs. Well, when you're looking to get yourself masks, why not check out our friends over at Camp Blood Customs out of New York State and order your specific custom mask from any of the films. All orders are made specifically. Your needs and wants are. Make sure you find Camp Blood Customs on Facebook, Instagram, and all over social media and order yours today.
Hi, I'm Adrian Paul, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.